February 14th, 1929. Chicago, Illinois. 7 men are standing in a garage on North Clark Street. Relaxed. Comfortable. Waiting on a whiskey delivery. Then a car pulls up outside. 4 men get out. 2 of them are wearing police uniforms. The men inside the garage see the uniforms and do exactly what they are told. They line up against the wall. Hands up. Cooperative. Because they figure it is just a raid. Lawyers will sort it out. They will be back on the street by tomorrow. Then the 2 men in civilian clothes reach inside their coats. Thompson submachine guns. 70 rounds. 7 men dead on a cold garage floor. Executed against a brick wall while they thought they were being arrested. The man who ordered it was not even in Chicago. He was at his mansion in Miami Beach, sitting in the sun. And when reporters called him for a comment, he said, with a straight face, "The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran." His name is Al Capone. He is 29 years old. He is worth what today would be $1.7 billion. And he is the most powerful, most feared criminal in the history of the United States. The movie gives you the glory, the cocaine, the mansion, the famous last stand. But the real story does not end with a gun in his hands. It ends with a man sitting alone in a Florida mansion, talking to people who are not there. His empire gone. His mind gone. Destroyed not by any rival, not by any bullet, not by any prison cell. Destroyed by a disease he had known about for 20 years and was too ashamed to treat. This is the real Scarface story. And it is darker than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. Before we go any further, drop your city in the comments right now. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? I want to see the Syndicate Files family from every corner of the world in those comments. And if this is your first video on this channel, do not leave without hitting subscribe. Every single week we go this deep, real history, real facts, the stories that most people never get told the full truth of. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with someone who thinks they already know who Al Capone was. Because I promise you, after this video, they will realize they did not know the half of it. Now let us go back to Brooklyn. Al Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York, on January 17, 1899. His parents were Italian immigrants who arrived in the United States in 1893. His father, Gabriele, was a barber and his mother, Teresa, was a seamstress. Read that again. A barber's son. 9 children in the family. The father cuts hair for a living, the mother sews clothing. They are not criminals. They are not connected to the underworld. They are exactly what they appear to be. Hard-working Italian immigrants trying to build a life in a country that did not always want them there. There is nothing in Alphonse Capone's childhood that makes his future inevitable. Nothing that marks him as a future crime lord. And that is perhaps the most important detail in the entire story. Because it means that everything that followed was a choice. A series of choices, made one, by a young man who was smarter than the system around him and impatient with waiting for the system to notice. After leaving school at age 14, Al Capone worked as a candy store clerk, a bowling alley pin boy, an ammunition plant laborer, and a book bindery cutter while serving in 2 kid gangs. Bands of delinquent children known for vandalism and petty crime that were common in early 20th century New York. He quit school not because he was stupid. He quit because he hit a teacher in the face after she disciplined him. That single incident, a 14-year-old boy's explosive response to authority, is the first window into the personality that would define everything that came after. Al Capone did not take being told what to do. Not by teachers. Not by rivals. Not by politicians. And not by the law. After leaving school, he drifted through those odd jobs and those street gangs until a job changed everything. He started working at a place called the Harvard Inn, a saloon on Coney Island run by a man named Frankie Yale, a genuinely dangerous organized crime figure who had given himself the respectable sounding name because his actual name, Francesco Ioil, carried too much street weight to project the image he wanted. Capone happened into working at the Harvard Inn. He starts there as a dishwasher, but this is a key moment in his life because he meets some people there who are serious players in the underworld, serious criminal figures. At the Harvard Inn, Capone went from dishwasher to bartender to bouncer. He was big, he was physically imposing, and he was absolutely unafraid of confrontation. He was exactly the kind of young man that organized crime at every level has always sought out and absorbed. And it was at the Harvard Inn, while he was still a teenager, that two things happened which shaped the rest of his life. One public, one deeply private. The public thing, a scar. In a youthful scrape at the Harvard Inn, a young hoodlum named Frank Galluccio slashed Capone with a knife or razor across his left cheek after Capone made a crude comment to Galluccio's sister, prompting the later nickname Scarface. 3 deep cuts across the left side of his face. Permanent, unmistakable, and absolutely hated by the man who carried them. The press began referring to Capone as Scarface, a nickname he hated. It was never used in his presence. In every photograph he ever posed for, Capone turned his right side to the camera. He spent his entire public life trying to make sure the world only saw the side of his face that was unmarked. The private thing, a disease. Capone began in Chicago as a bouncer in a brothel, which is thought to be most likely where he contracted syphilis. Capone was aware of being infected at an early stage, and timely use of salvarsan probably could have cured the infection, but he apparently never sought treatment. He knew. He was aware. And he chose not to treat it, out of shame, out of denial, out of the simple fact that admitting you had syphilis in 1919 was something a man in his position, building his reputation on toughness and invincibility, simply could not do. That decision, made in his early 20s, probably on a single night when embarrassment won over common sense, would become the slow-burning fuse that destroyed everything he built. But that destruction was decades away. In 1919, Al Capone was 20 years old, recently married to a young Irish-American woman named May Corflin, the father of a newborn son named Sonny, and about to make the move that would transform his life completely. His mentor Johnny Torrio had left Brooklyn years earlier to manage the criminal empire of a Chicago boss named Big Jim Colosimo, a man who ran hundreds of brothels and gambling operations in the city and had made himself enormously rich doing it. Now Torrio was calling Capone to Chicago. Torrio had worked for the Syndicate crime boss Big Jim Colosimo, who operated hundreds of brothels and gambling rackets in the Windy City. Capone was employed as a bouncer in various brothels where he contracted syphilis, an infection that would later kill him. Chicago in 1920 was a city on the edge of an extraordinary transformation. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, Prohibition, had just gone into effect. The manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol was now illegal across the entire country. And what that law created, almost instantly, was the single greatest criminal business opportunity in American history. Millions of ordinary Americans wanted to drink. They were not going to stop wanting to drink because a law told them to. And whoever could supply them, safely, reliably, at scale, was going to become fabulously, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. Johnny Torrio saw this immediately. He wanted to build a bootlegging operation that would make everything Colosimo had built look like pocket change. The problem was Colosimo himself. Colosimo was shot to death the same year Capone came to Chicago. Although nobody was ever arrested for Colosimo's murder, many believe Torrio ordered the hit, and that Capone was an accomplice in the killing. Big Jim Colosimo, the man who had built the Chicago criminal empire, died in his own restaurant. Nobody was ever charged. And within weeks, Torrio and Capone moved into the bootlegging business with a speed and scale that confirmed exactly how long they had been planning for Colosimo to be out of the way. The year Capone took over the Chicago outfit, the gang's gross income from their racketeering was conservatively estimated by the United States Attorney General's office at $105 million a year. It had a weekly payroll of $300,000 for the 1,000 men employed and an estimated $15 million per year for bribes. Read those numbers. $105 million a year. In the 1920s, a weekly payroll of $300,000, and $15 million a year spent exclusively on bribes, on keeping the police, the politicians, and the judicial system in Chicago turned away from what the outfit was doing. This was not a street gang. This was a corporation. A vertically integrated criminal enterprise with supply chains, distribution networks, a security apparatus, a public relations strategy, and a financial structure sophisticated enough to sustain itself for years. And at the center of it, moving up through the ranks with a speed that astonished everyone around him, was Al Capone. In 1924, Torrio was shot multiple times in an assassination attempt outside his home by members of the rival North Side Gang. He survived. But the experience shook him so completely that when he got out of the hospital, he made a decision that nobody expected. In 1925, Capone became boss when Torrio, seriously wounded in an assassination attempt, surrendered control and retired to Brooklyn. Al Capone was 26 years old. He was now the boss of the most powerful criminal organization in America, and Chicago was about to enter the bloodiest, most violent, most extraordinary era in its history. When Al Capone took over the Chicago outfit in 1925, he did not inherit a peaceful kingdom. He inherited a war. The North Side Gang, led first by Jaime Weiss and then by a cold-eyed Irish gangster named George Bugs Moran, had been fighting the outfit for years. They had tried to kill Torrio. They had tried to kill Capone himself on multiple occasions. In one incident, Moran and his associates drove 6 cars past a hotel in Cicero, Illinois, where Capone and his associates were having lunch and showered the building with more than 1,000 bullets. 1,000 bullets. Into a building where Capone was eating lunch. This is the reality of what it actually meant to be in charge of organized crime in Chicago in the 1920s. It was not glamorous. It was not secure. Every single day was a day someone might be waiting for you with a gun. Capone responded to this environment the way he responded to every threat, with overwhelming force and zero hesitation. He expanded the outfit's territory through a combination of strategic alliances and targeted violence. Rivals who cooperated got a share of the business. Rivals who refused were killed. The process was relentless and completely consistent. Capone was reportedly worth $100 million in 1927, equal to $1.7 billion today. $1.7 billion. In today's money. And that was in 1927, 4 years before he was convicted of anything. He had achieved this at age 28. He was the richest criminal in American history by an extraordinary margin. What the movie does not show you, what most people do not fully understand, is how Capone maintained this empire. It was not just through violence. It was through the most comprehensive system of political corruption that any American city had ever seen. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre and other gangland killings led influential citizens to demand government action. But Capone's mutually profitable relationships with Mayor William Hale Thompson and the Chicago Police Department meant he seemed safe from law enforcement. Mayor William Hale Thompson, the mayor of Chicago, on Capone's payroll. The police department, functionally, on Capone's payroll. The judges who heard cases involving Capone's men, in many instances, on Capone's payroll. Chicago in the late 1920s was not a city that happened to have a crime problem. It was a city that had been purchased. The entire mechanism of local government, the people elected to protect ordinary citizens, to enforce the laws, to ensure that justice meant something, had been quietly bought and integrated into the operation of a criminal empire. And Capone was smart about how he managed this. He was not just a thug who handed out envelopes of cash. He was a public figure. Capone apparently reveled in attention, such as the cheers from spectators when he appeared at baseball games. He made donations to various charities and was viewed by many as a modern-day Robin Hood. He donated to charities. He opened soup kitchens during the Depression. He had a public persona carefully constructed around the image of a generous, community-minded businessman who happened to operate in a legally grey area. Large numbers of ordinary Chicagoans genuinely liked Al Capone. They saw him as someone who provided alcohol when the government had made alcohol illegal, jobs when the Depression had destroyed the economy, food when people were going hungry. What they did not see was the price. From 1924 to 1930, authorities counted some 16 gang-related murders in 1924. This brand of slaying continued until 1929, reaching a high of 64 murders in 1 year during that time. 64 gang murders. In a single year. In a single American city. Men shot in the street, in restaurants, in bars. Bodies found in car trunks. People who crossed the outfit, who talked to investigators, who aligned with the wrong faction at the wrong moment, they died. Their families grieved. And the machine kept running. By 1929, the war with Bugs Moran had reached a point where Capone decided the only solution was to eliminate the North Side Gang entirely. The plan was elegant and utterly cold-blooded. It is thought that Capone's gang secretly lured Moran's Northsiders to the garage at the Moran headquarters on the promise of a stolen, cut-rate shipment of whiskey supplied by Detroit's Purple Gang, which was associated with Capone. The men arrived at the garage at 2122 North Clark Street expecting a delivery. Instead, 4 men arrived, 2 in police uniforms, 2 in civilian clothes. The men inside the garage complied with what they believed was a police raid. They lined up against the wall. Inside, they lined up 7 of Moran's unarmed henchmen against the wall like it was a police raid, then pulled machine guns from their jackets and opened fire. 70 bullets later, all 7 mob members lay dead or dying in pools of their own blood. Bugs Moran himself was not there. He had been running a few minutes late. He saw what looked like a police car outside the garage and turned around to get a coffee. He missed his own execution by minutes. When reporters reached Moran for a comment about the massacre, he said a single sentence, "Only Capone kills like that." And when reporters reached Capone in Florida, he said with perfect composure, "The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran." The murder of 7 men in broad daylight on Valentine's Day morning was not just a crime. It was a turning point. The dramatic scope of the crime and the headlines it garnered focused so much attention on Al Capone that President Herbert Hoover told his Treasury Department to get that man. The President of the United States, personally directing his Treasury Department to destroy Al Capone. This was now beyond a local law enforcement problem. The entire weight of the federal government was turning toward one man in Chicago. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. Because the government that was coming for Capone, the most powerful government in the world, directed by the president himself, could not get him for murder, could not get him for bootlegging, could not get him for the corruption of an entire city government, could not get him for the dozens of violent deaths that had occurred during his reign. He was too careful, too insulated. Too many witnesses were too afraid. Too many investigators were on his payroll. The weapon they eventually found, the thing that brought down the most powerful criminal in American history, was a ledger book. Numbers. Addition and subtraction. The simple, devastating fact that Al Capone had been living a life worth tens of millions of dollars a year and had not paid a single dollar of income tax on any of it. They did not have to prove Capone was orchestrating gambling, protection, prostitution, and bootlegging rackets. Simply that he was not paying taxes on his income from those rackets. And it was clear that Capone had to have substantial income to support such a lavish lifestyle. Not a single Tommy gun. Not a single murder charge. Not a single witness to a bootlegging operation. Just accountants. Patient, methodical, federal accountants building a case out of numbers that proved Al Capone had received enormous income and paid no tax on it. On June 5, 1931, Capone was indicted for 22 counts of federal income tax evasion for the years 1925 through 1929. In October, Capone was tried, found guilty on 3 of the 23 counts, and sentenced to 11 years in prison and $50,000 in fines and court costs. 11 years. For tax evasion. The man who had run Chicago like his personal kingdom for 6 years, who had ordered the murder of dozens of people, who had put the mayor of the city in his pocket, was going to prison for not paying his taxes. He entered Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in May 1932. He was 33 years old. And the disease that he had been carrying silently inside him for over a decade, the disease he had been too ashamed to treat, was already beginning to do the work that no rival gang and no law enforcement agency had ever managed to do. It was beginning to eat his brain. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, May 1932. Al Capone arrived in prison and immediately did what Al Capone always did. He started working the system. Capone was sent to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary in May 1932, aged 33. Upon his arrival, Capone was diagnosed with syphilis and gonorrhea. The prison medical examination confirmed what Capone had known, or at least suspected, for over a decade. The syphilis was in his system. It had been there since his early 20s. Over 10 years of going untreated. But in Atlanta, Capone was still Capone. Even in prison, his reputation and his money meant that the rules bent around him. While in Atlanta in prison, Capone was treated incredibly well, given an easy job, tipped guards, and had unlimited access to the warden. He tipped the guards. He had access to the warden. He was living a version of prison that bore almost no resemblance to what ordinary inmates experienced. Word of this reached the federal authorities, and they made a decision. If Capone was going to game the system at Atlanta, they were going to put him somewhere the system could not be gamed. Authorities were concerned that Capone would file a writ of habeas corpus and be able to get out of prison for a court appearance. To prevent this, they sent him to a maximum facility institution, Alcatraz, where prisoners were barred from submitting such writs. In August 1934, Al Capone was transferred to Alcatraz, the new federal penitentiary sitting in the cold water of San Francisco Bay, off the coast of a city that had never been part of his empire. The Rock. A place designed specifically to be inescapable and unfixable. No political connections reached Alcatraz. No money-made guards bend the rules there. No reputation made any difference to the correctional officers who ran the place. For the first time in his adult life, Al Capone was genuinely, completely powerless. And it was here, on this island prison in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, that the disease he had been carrying for 15 years accelerated with devastating effect. At Alcatraz, Capone's decline became increasingly evident, as neurosyphilis progressively eroded his mental faculties. His formal diagnosis of syphilis of the brain was made in February 1938. Syphilis of the brain. Neurosyphilis. This is what happens when the bacterium Treponema pallidum, the organism that causes syphilis, goes untreated long enough to cross into the central nervous system. It does not just damage the body. It destroys the mind. It attacks the brain tissue itself, causing progressive dementia, disorientation, personality changes, hallucinations, and a complete collapse of the cognitive functions that make a person who they are. The man who had run the most sophisticated criminal operation in American history, the man who had bribed the mayor of Chicago, orchestrated the Valentine's Day Massacre, managed a business empire worth nearly $2 billion in today's money, and outmaneuvered the federal government for 6 years. That man's brain was being systematically destroyed by a bacterial infection he had been too embarrassed to treat 20 years earlier. By the time Capone got to Alcatraz in 1934, his moods were erratic, he was lonely, and because he was surrounded by the worst criminals the penal system had to offer, he felt as though he was never safe. The confidence, the swagger, the absolute command presence that had defined him, all of it was beginning to dissolve. He became frightened, confused, unable to follow basic prison routines consistently. There was one moment at Alcatraz that captures the change better than any other. The man had started to dress up in a winter coat and gloves inside his heated jail cell. Al Capone, sitting inside a heated prison cell on warm California days, bundled up in a winter coat and gloves, not understanding where he was, not understanding what the temperature was, not understanding, at some fundamental level, what was happening to him. In June 1936, the physical dangers of prison caught up with him too. On June 23, 1936, Capone was stabbed and superficially wounded by fellow Alcatraz inmate James C. Lucas. Stabbed inside a federal prison. The man who had once been so feared that entire criminal organizations arranged their operations around staying out of his way was now being stabbed by a fellow prisoner in a federal laundry room. The only comfort he seemed to find was music. Due to his good behavior, Capone was permitted to play banjo in the Alcatraz prison band, the Rock Islanders, which gave regular Sunday concerts for other inmates. The most powerful gangster in American history, sitting in a prison band on Alcatraz Island, playing banjo for other prisoners on Sunday afternoons. Whatever this image makes you feel, sit with it for a moment. Because it is real. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the world had moved on completely. The Chicago outfit kept operating. Other men ran it. The empire Capone had built did not miss him, because the systems he had established were strong enough to function without him. He was no longer necessary to the thing he had created, and the men who were now running it had no obligation, no loyalty, no reason to fight for his early release or his legacy. By 1938, his wife May was watching the medical reports come in and making a decision. His wife May seized on Al's increasingly odd behavior and petitioned the warden to release him from Alcatraz. The fact that cinched the deal was a formal diagnosis of syphilis of the brain made in February of 1938. Capone was released on November 16, 1939, on the grounds of good behavior and, more cogently, his medical condition. He walked out of Alcatraz on a November morning in 1939, 7 years after entering federal prison. He was 40 years old. And the man who walked out was not the man who had walked in. Not even close. The empire was gone. The power was gone. The money was largely gone. Lawyers, legal fees, and years of prison had consumed most of it. The political connections were gone. The network of loyal men who had once moved on his word was gone. Chicago had continued without him and had no place for him now. All that was left was the disease. Working away, slowly, relentlessly, inside the brain of the man who had once ruled the most dangerous city in America. Palm Island, Miami Beach. January 1940. A man sits on the terrace of a large house looking out at the water. The house is beautiful, a 10,000 square foot mansion on a private island between Miami and Miami Beach, purchased in 1928 for $40,000. There is a pool. There are palm trees. There is the sound of the ocean. On the surface, it looks like retirement, like comfort, like a man who got out and found peace. But the man sitting on that terrace is not at peace. He is talking to people who are not there. He is searching the grounds of his own home for buried treasure that does not exist. He is experiencing the slow, grinding, total destruction of everything that made him who he was. Due to his failing health, Capone was released from prison on November 16, 1939, and referred to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for the treatment of syphilitic paralysis. Because of his unsavory reputation, Johns Hopkins refused to treat him, but Baltimore's Union Memorial Hospital did. The most famous criminal in America, rejected by a hospital because of his reputation. He was treated at Union Memorial instead, and he was genuinely grateful. Capone was grateful for the compassionate care that he received and donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to Union Memorial Hospital in 1939. Those trees are still there today. 2 cherry trees, planted by Al Capone's direction, as a thank you for the hospital that agreed to treat him when Johns Hopkins would not. That detail, small, human, oddly tender, is one of the strangest footnotes in the history of American organized crime. After his treatment in Baltimore, Capone moved to Palm Island permanently. He was supposed to rest. He was supposed to recover. And for a brief period, it seemed like he might stabilize. Then came the discovery that changed everything he had been hoping for. In 1942, after mass production of penicillin was started in the United States, Capone was one of the first American patients treated by the new drug. Though it was too late for him to reverse the damage to his brain, it did slow down the progression of the disease. He was one of the first people in America to receive penicillin, the antibiotic that, had it existed 20 years earlier, could have cured his syphilis completely and saved everything. One of the first people to receive the drug that would have saved him, receiving it 20 years too late to save anything at all. The penicillin slowed the progression, but it could not undo what had already been done. The brain damage was permanent. The neurons that had been destroyed by 15 years of untreated neurosyphilis did not regenerate. The cognitive function that had been lost did not return. In 1946, his physician and a Baltimore psychiatrist examined him and concluded that Capone had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. Sit with that sentence. The man who had built and run a criminal empire worth nearly $2 billion in today's money. The man who had bribed the mayor of Chicago and the entire police department. The man who had orchestrated the most infamous mass murder in the history of American organized crime. The man who had faced down the federal government for 6 years and kept winning, until the accountants got him. That man, at age 47, had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. Not as a metaphor. Not as an insult. As a formal medical diagnosis, rendered by a physician and a psychiatrist after a clinical examination. The final years on Palm Island were a kind of extended, private horror. The once terrifying mobster was seen losing control of his bladder and defecating in his bed seemingly uncontrollably while he suffered from hallucinations and visions of his violent past. Hallucinations. Incontinence. Total loss of physical self-control. The man who had prided himself on his appearance, the tailored suits, the fedora cocked at exactly the right angle, the silk ties and the diamond pins, now could not control his own body. Former associates came to visit occasionally in the early years at Palm Island. What they found disturbed them. This was not retirement. This was not a man enjoying the fruits of a life lived outside the law. This was the wreckage of a human being, attended to by a faithful wife who had every reason to leave and chose to stay.
My Capone.
An Irish-American Catholic woman who had married a 20-year-old Italian gangster in 1918 and stayed beside him through everything. Through the years of violence and power in Chicago. Through the tax evasion trial and the 11-year sentence. Through Atlanta and Alcatraz. Through the Baltimore hospital and the Palm Island mansion and the long, slow collapse of everything that had once made her husband remarkable. She stayed. Every day. Caring for a man whose mind was gone, whose empire was gone, whose fame had curdled into notoriety and then into something like pity. She did it because she had made a promise. And whatever else you can say about the Capone story, May's loyalty, unfilmed, unrecorded, unrewarded, is one of its most genuinely human elements. By early 1947, Capone's physical health was collapsing alongside his mind. He had a stroke. Pneumonia followed the stroke, taking hold in a body that had no reserves left to fight it. Al Capone died of cardiac arrest in 1947, but his decline began earlier. After his transfer to Alcatraz prison, he was convicted of tax evasion in 1931. His mental and physical condition deteriorated from paresis, a late stage of syphilis. He was released in November 1939 and was sent to a Baltimore mental hospital before he retired to his Florida estate. Later he retired to his Florida estate, where he died from cardiac arrest in 1947, a powerless recluse. January 25, 1947. Al Capone died at Palm Island, Miami Beach. He was 48 years old. The death certificate listed bronchial pneumonia as the primary cause of death. Apoplexy, a stroke, as a contributing factor. The underlying neurosyphilis was left off entirely. Even in death, the most famous criminal in American history was the subject of a cover story. His family, even then, could not bring themselves to write the full truth on his own death certificate. He was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, brought back to the city he had once owned, to lie in ground that remembered him. The funeral was private. Most of the people who had once followed his orders were dead, in prison, or had simply moved on to serving different bosses long ago. Now let us step back and look at the full picture, because this is where the real story diverges most dramatically from every movie that has ever been made about Al Capone, and from the mythology that has grown up around him for a century. The movie, the 1983 film with Brian De Palma and Al Pacino, gives you Tony Montana, a Cuban immigrant who builds a cocaine empire in Miami, lives in a palatial mansion, delivers the famous line about saying hello to his little friend, and dies in a final blaze of gunfire that is one of the most iconic scenes in the history of American cinema. It is extraordinary filmmaking. It has almost nothing to do with Al Capone's actual life. The real Scarface did not die in a gunfight. He did not go out with a machine gun in his hands. He did not make a final defiant stand against the enemies who had come to destroy him. He died in a bed, confused, barely conscious of where he was or what year it was. His brain gone, his power gone, his empire running without him, under other men's names, for 16 years before he finally died. And the real story is more disturbing than the movie for reasons that have nothing to do with violence. It is disturbing because of what it tells you about the distance between the image and the reality. About what it actually costs to live the way Capone lived. About the consequences that do not arrive with gunshots and explosion. The consequences that arrive slowly, invisibly, over years and decades, until one day the man looking out from behind your eyes is not the man you intended to become. Capone passed syphilis to his wife, May, when she was a young woman who had no knowledge of what he had been doing. Their son Sonny was born with congenital syphilis, a disease passed from father to mother to unborn child, and spent his entire life managing the consequences of a decision his father made as a teenager in a Brooklyn brothel. Their only child, Albert, nicknamed Sonny, was born 2 months premature, reportedly with congenital syphilis, an STD Capone unknowingly passed to May. An innocent child, born into suffering because of a disease his father had contracted before the boy was even conceived, and been too ashamed to treat. That is the part of the Scarface story that no movie has ever told. Not the gunfights and the money and the power. The child. The wife. The private wreckage that the glamour of organized crime always leaves behind for the people closest to it. Al Capone died at 48 with the mind of a 12-year-old, talking to people who were not there, being cared for by a woman who deserved better, in a mansion on a private island in Florida. That is the real ending. Not a blaze of glory. Not a final stand. Not even a dramatic arrest. Just a man, alone in his own mind, surrounded by the people who loved him, destroyed not by his enemies but by a decision he made at 20 years old and never had the courage to undo. That is the real Scarface story. And it was darker than any movie ever dared to tell you. And that is the full, documented, unflinching truth of Al Capone. The boy from Brooklyn who built the most powerful criminal empire in American history and ran it from age 26. The man who put the mayor of Chicago in his pocket and spent $15 million a year on bribes. The man who ordered 7 people executed in a garage on Valentine's Day morning and then commented about it from a beach in Florida. The man who survived every rival gang, every assassination attempt, and every law enforcement effort directed at him for 6 years, and was finally brought down by a group of federal accountants with ledger books. And then the man who spent the final 8 years of his life in a Florida mansion with the mental capacity of a child, destroyed not by bullets or prison or betrayal, but by a disease he had known about for decades and been too ashamed to treat. The movie gives you the glory and leaves out the ending. The real story gives you both. And the real story is the one that stays with you. If this video had you locked in from that first scene in the garage all the way to this moment, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe. Because every single week on the Syndicate Files, this is what we do. We go past the myth, past the movie, past the cleaned up version of events that everyone already knows. And we show you what was actually there. The real people. The real decisions. The real consequences. Subscribe right now so you do not miss the next one. Give this video a like. And share it with someone who quotes Scarface but does not know how the real story ended. Because now you do. The Syndicate Files. The truth is always more dangerous than the legend.